is that this is significant. But I want to give you some of the theological basis to it, the missiological basis to it, because unless we can find it, we'll never become the movement that Jesus intended us to be. So keep going and be encouraged, because I think some amazing things are happening in our day. Now, I'm going to change gear and try and get on more or less onto the topic we originally agreed on. I did get some permission to share that stuff. And I think it kind of extends what was said last night, I hope, in some way. What I wanted to talk about is actually how we engage locally as agents of the King, as missionaries in God's kingdom. Let me go to I'm going to just take this across here because I'm going to sit around with this for a while. I've got a diagram for everything. If I had to kind of say that we evangelicals have tended to have a very selective reading of Scripture. I think all people do to some degree. We've tended to categorize, particularly when it comes to the life of Jesus, we've tended to focus our understanding on the cross, the salvation events in Jesus, the resurrection, the primary miracle where God raises the Son of God and in Him human beings it resurrects them in Jesus. It's a very significant event. And then the return, if I can point it that way. We've generally argued about the return. I guess there's as many views as the four usual views. But we've all pretty much as evangelicals, that's been our specialty. We kind of worked that one out, don't you think? The problem is with that, and I think all the stuff we've worked out there is good. Here's the problem, is that it's usually taken divorced from the context of which that was done. This is what happens when that happens in return. Can you guys see what I'm doing here on the board? Good. This is what happens. Whatever happened to the Jesus story? The whole 30 or something years he spent on the world, and his 3 years of ministry, not insignificant teachings, and his life and his ministry. What also, and this is what I want to share tonight, of the incarnation, let alone the pre-existence of Christ, which has implications for the doctrine of creation, although I won't go there too much. But listen, I want to focus on this piece particularly. When we think about incarnation generally around Christmas time, it's schmaltzed up big time, and I think we've pretty much found it hard to really find the real meaning of Christmas, really, because of all what's happening around about us. The cultural co-option of Christmas has taken place. If you take this piece out, the Jesus events, the teachings, the fact that Jesus is the archetypal Christian, the model, the exemplar of what it means to be the perfect human being, you lose our own humanity is lost, because that's what we must become like. Discipleship is lost when you take this out of the equation. When you only focus on this part of the equation, folks, what will happen as a result is you'll end up in what Dallas Willard calls the gospel of sin management. The gospel of kind of somewhat cosmic fire insurance, some people have called it. That is what happens when you die. That I've now given my heart to Jesus, now I'm just waiting for His to come return. But there's no notion how I live my life. It's because we've taken this aspect of our equation. What I want to focus on tonight is what happens when we take the incarnation out of our equation. Now, the incarnation, folks, is not an insignificant doctrine. I would say it goes really to the heart of the Christian message. Now, let me repeat it here just to kind of know what we're dealing with. The incarnation teaches us that God, immortal God, God omnipotent, a being of inconceivable power and intelligence. You cannot even get your mind around what kind of being we are dealing with here, right? We only see the fringes of who He really is, right? And you can, even your wildest guess cannot really get into this kind of person we're dealing with here. This God becomes a human being. Not only that, becomes a baby, fills a couple of diapers, I guess, along the way, and is in the neighborhood for 30 years, and no one notices. Well, what does that say about God? What does that say about how God engages human beings? Whatever we might say about how the incarnation teaches us about theology, that is how we think about God and how we conceive of God, and I think the loss of that leads to terrible impoverishment in our theology. But whatever we might say about how He engages, the loss of the incarnation, I should say, gives us a model of how we should engage the world. The loss of it means impoverishment in knowing how we actually should engage. I would suggest that if we believe in the incarnation, this is how God engages the world, then we ourselves as God's people, we who follow him in his way, must become incarnational. Now I'm L, right? But in this case, this belongs to that word. Incarnational is that we ourselves become a people who follow in the same pattern of Jesus. And what I want to share the rest of the night tonight will feature pretty much around how we as God's people might follow in the way. And I want to suggest some ways, and if a lot of this loses you, because in some senses we've lost something of what it means to engage incarnationally in the way of Jesus, going among a group of people, learning how to communicate from within a people, honoring their humanity and their culture in their place. We've lost what it means to be a missionary, going cross-cultural, because we've assumed that everyone understands what we're on about. Everyone must come to church in order to hear the gospel. Everyone, we presume, of course, that they know what we're on about. They know our language. If you're now living in subcultural Papua New Guinea, as I suggest we are in America, you must learn to engage people where they're at. Because if you fail to do that, you fail to be the sent one. We are, by the way, the missionary people of God, are we not? We're the ones who've been sent out into the world, are we not? And when we require people to come to us to hear the gospel, crossing cultures as they come, we're asking them to do the cross-cultural work we ourselves are called to do. It's our job to communicate the gospel meaningfully in whatever culture we might find ourselves. Americans need you to go out there and be good representatives of what it means to be followers of Jesus and communicate the gospel. So these are ways in which we might do this. I've, as a kind of classic preacher kind of thing, I'm not really that, but I'm giving you around some P's. There's 6 of them here, right? I think there might be 7 if I kind of counted them properly. The first P, that's the letter P, is the P of presence. And presence, what I mean is, and let me reference it up against what Jesus has done in becoming a human being, is that he is fully identified with our humanity. There's no human experience that he does not understand. Hebrews teaches us about his capacity to empathize with us in all things, having been inside our experience, right? There's a human in the Godhead now, which is an interesting thing to say. Paul says it. If you think about that, there's a human being at the center of the Trinity. So, in other words, in becoming a human being, Jesus, the eternal Son, takes upon himself human form, and in so doing makes the deepest possible identity with us. He becomes human. In other words, he's an insider on our experience. And so we, when we become incarnational, follow the same way. Our job is to become and to engage people, be present to them fully, more and more engaging them in their terms and on their terms. Brian mentioned the term of actually being a church for the community, and I want to recommend that. Let me take it a little bit step further for you. To be truly incarnational, you move from being a church just for the community to being a church of the, ultimately of the community. And let me go this way. A church for the community to a church with the community, that is the non-Christian community, and then a church of the people you're trying to reach. This is what good mission work does, you see. We actually go in the way of Jesus among them, and we bring the gospel to them in ways that make sense. This is what missionaries do, and I want to suggest that in engaging the context in which we live today, we have to ourselves become like missionaries more and more. So in a sense, presence guides us. The presence of Jesus in his humanity guides us in how we might become more present with a community. The one that follows after that is the word proximity. Proximity is really quite related to presence, but it's different. If presence means his identification with us, proximity is that we go where people are at. Jesus goes into the places where people are at. Remember, when you look at the life of Jesus, he's not just in the temple. He does a little bit of that and a bit of synagogue work, but mostly his work is outside of the sacred spaces. He goes to where people are at. If he was around today, I guess he would go to the pubs. Or, other places people meet, right? because that's his kind of holiness. It's a redemptive. It's not abstracting ourselves from the world. It's actually redeeming the world. We've tended to make holiness into moralism, and I think we've made a big mistake as a result. So we go to where the people are. We don't expect them necessarily to come to us. That's a good thing, but I mean, we don't expect it. We go to where they're at. We're teaching missionary practice in the West, and this is what we do in any other missionary setting, is that you go and church follows mission. Now let me do this quite practically. We have tended to front load the church up front. That is, we're going to plant a church and we've already designed what that church would look like. So ecclesiology, if I'd said it technically, is front loaded in the equation. And I want to suggest that's not good missionary practice, right? Because otherwise we'll just impose our form, our cultural expression on the church and the people we're trying to reach. Missionary practice is you go among a people group, and I would suggest you ask two fundamental questions there. Once you're there as agents of the King, there's two questions you ask. One, what is good news for this people group? Not presuming you know the answer until you get there. In other words, now you have to observe, what are they feeling? What's the idea of God? If anything, all people have that. Even if they claim to be atheists, that's an idea of God. Not many are. So what do they think about God as a people group? Where's their existential yearnings? What's the struggle? We call it sin, but what are the things they're dealing with? You have to now become an observer of culture. Paul in Athens observes the idolatry and interprets it and connects it back to the gospel, because idolatry is a clue to the human search for meaning and significance, purpose and belonging. And he understands it, that it's a false search, but it's an authentic coming out of a need to worship. I'm more worried when people don't worship idols. It means their spirit is dead. At least idolatry means that they're trying to worship something beyond themselves. And so our job is to redeem that. So you wouldn't know that until you actually ask the questions once you're there among your people group. Right? It's good practice. Slow down, cowboy. Listen. The person who actually invented the stethoscope was a person who said, listen to your patients. They're telling you the answer. And the stethoscope we still use it today. It's 120 years later. I think it was quite an old instrument too. The other question you ask is not only what is good news for this people group, but what is church for this people group. And you cannot know the answer until you get there. You watch how they meet, where they meet, where's the energy center, who are the gatekeepers here, what's the dynamic, what time, what place. And then you try and redeem those structures in ways that church might fit. This is good practice, and if we're going to become incarnational missionaries, the kinds of which I explained before, where every person gets to play, every believer is a church playing every church, church playing church, that's when the church really cooks. We're going to have to learn to become like missionaries again, and incarnational missionaries have got to be able to do these things. Basically, the idea of church follows mission, what is gospel for this people, what is church for this people, and you don't know until you get there. It's interesting. Another area, very fruitful place of mission in Western culture, I believe, is third places. Now, if you don't know the terminology of this, folks, then let me introduce it to you. The guy was Ray Oldenburg, was the writer, is The Last Great Place. And a very, very important text about what the loss of social spaces in America. He comes up with the terminology of third place. Third place. First place, you'll know, you don't use this terminology. Your first place is your home. And in America, it's the nuclear family kind of situation where you might have neighbors and have some interaction, but basically your home is the defensive unit. You come home to it. And it's a safe space, right? And it's legitimate. But it's the one place. And actually, mission's not that easy to do it. And I think house churches are, to some degree, problematic in this regard, is that they can be difficult. For strangers to come in. I've got to tell you that even someone, walking into a strange group of